I would like to welcome everyone to this very special event. I'm Grzegorz Ekiert. I'm the director of the Center for European Studies and the professor of government. This event is co-organized by Berggruen Institute of Governance and the WorldPost, which is the new venture of Adriana Huffington and Berggruen Institute. Let me thank a couple of colleagues for all the efforts in organizing this event. Elaine Papoulias, who is the director of the Center for European Studies, and Dawn Nakagawa, executive vice president of Berggruen Foundation. Without their efforts, this event wouldn't happen. Now, the topic of the discussion today is the situation in Europe after the Russian annexation of Crimea and the invasion of eastern Ukraine. In the last several years, were not particularly good for Europe. The euro crisis, the sovereign debt crisis, the disagreements about institution and architecture of the EU, and the rising populism and right-wing nationalism. Now, the Russian aggression on Ukraine added dangerous security dimension to the situation and to those problems. It looks like almost a perfect storm. And analogies to 1938 may not be so far-fetched. We have great opportunity today to discuss these issues with two distinguished and immensely respected Europeans who were involved in European foreign affairs for many years. Before I introduce our speakers, let me invite Nicholas Berggruen, who is the president and the founder of the Berggruen Institute, and express my gratitude for your support for this event and hopefully for many similar events in the future. Nicholas.
Well, I'm really the one who has to thank you. Thank you, Harvard. Thank you for the Center of European Studies. I think we are at a crucial time for Europe. It seems that over the last few years we're at a crucial time every day for Europe, but now I think the dimension is even more significant geopolitically. Just to say why in the world are we here, the Berggruen Institute on Governance has worked on a number of different issues. One of its key projects is Europe, and we've put together a Council for the Future of Europe, which is actually headed by Mario Monti, and we have key representatives of each country who are helping us think through solutions for Europe. And Carl Bildt is luckily a member of that group as well. And so a couple of other people who are here with you, including your own Neil Ferguson, also Juan-Luis Cebrián and Sylvie Goulard, who are here. So we are very, we're very dedicated to finding solutions for Europe. And in my mind, at least, we are a little bit at a moment of truth for Europe in two ways. And the Ukraine sort of illustrates this. Can Europe, in essence, afford economically to help the Ukraine? And if it doesn't get its economic house in order to be dynamic and productive, that makes it harder. So it's a long-term indirect question. And then the other question is, can Europe, from a foreign policy standpoint, really have its weight again vis-à-vis something as important on the doorstep of Europe like the Ukraine? So we're very grateful to be here. The WorldPost, just to say one word, is really a publication that was created this last January between the Institute and Huffington Post to give a voice to people who are thoughtful about key issues around the world, and we try to give different parts of the world a sort of their views. And I think we've done so, including on the Ukraine crisis, but Middle Eastern crisis, China, etc. Nathan Gardels is the editor-in-chief, and so far so good. Not only do we get great contributions, and here this is the greatest talent pool, or one of the greatest talent pools on Earth. We'd love to get your contributions if you have something to write. We also have the distribution that Huffington Post has, which is enormous. So we are very grateful that we can empower interesting views. So more important, Mario Monti and Carl Bildt.
Let me very briefly introduce our distinguished speakers. I don't want to shorten the time for our discussion. So Carl Bildt has been the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Sweden since 2006. And from 91 to 94, Mr. Bildt served as Sweden Prime Minister. He was the first conservative Prime Minister of Sweden in 61 years when he was elected. He had distinguished role in solving the Balkan crisis and ending the civil wars in the Balkans, served as a co-chair of Dayton peace talks and as a special envoy of the UN Secretary General for the Balkans, together with the former Polish Foreign Affairs Minister Radosław Sikorski, whom we are missing in this event. Some of you know that he was planning to come, but was kept by internal Polish politics in Poland. So together with Mr. Sikorski, Mr. Bildt really designed the Eastern EU partnership to foster cooperation between EU and countries east of the Polish border. Of course, Vladimir Putin cynically used that idea to justify his aggression on Ukraine. Our second speaker is Mario Monti. Mario Monti is an Italian economist who served as the Prime Minister of Italy from 2011 to 2013. He is currently the president of the Bocconi University in Milan. Mr. Monti had a very distinguished career in the European Commission, was in charge of internal markets, financial services and tax policy, and competition, all crucial portfolio in the European Commission. So we are very grateful to you both for visiting Harvard, and I would like to welcome you here, and we'll proceed with two short presentations and then discussion. Please do not be alarmed when Mr. Bildt will leave 3:45. He unfortunately needs to be in New York, so he will make an early exit from this room.
Thanks. I will leave 4:15, so you don't need to be that scared. But let me start by saying it's a pleasure to be here. I'll start with some introductory remarks on the subject, and then I hope there will be the time for discussion. We are a century after the big European catastrophe of 1914, and what is happening is that the specter of war is once again haunting Europe. It was, as a matter of fact, a little more than a decade ago that the European Union made its first and so far only attempt, to formulate a European security strategy. And it then proudly stated, and I quote, "Europe has never been so prosperous, so secure, nor so free," end quote, and that we had entered into, I quote again, "a period of peace and stability unprecedented in European history." Today, these words ring fairly hollow. This is, of course, a year not only a century after 1914, it's 3/4 of a century since 1939, and it's a quarter of a century since 1989. And it was really only in 1989 that we could sort of get rid of the last of the legacies of 1914 and start to building a Europe whole and free, democratic and dynamic. And there was indeed remarkable progress, making it possible to write those particular sentences that I referred to in 2003. We saw a number of things happening that were good, although we also had a decade of war in the Balkans. But all of this was made possible by the peaceful collapse of the Soviet Union as the communist system there crumbled and collapsed under the weight of its own massive failures. The red flag of empire and ideology disappeared over the Kremlin and was replaced by the red, blue and white national flag of Russia. I remember in those days we were consulting also the knowledge of Harvard to try to get a better understanding of where Russia was heading. And I vividly remember a small conference that we had in Stockholm where we had invited Professor Richard Pipes, whose Russia under the old regime is probably the single best book about Russia so far ever written. And I asked him, Professor, are you optimistic or pessimistic concerning whether this Russia is going to be a democracy, a European country, and whatever? And he, as professors do, was hesitating slightly, and then he said that he was optimistic. And me being a politician, and politicians being somewhat, we have a somewhat different time perspective at times, thought that he was talking in terms of months, or perhaps in terms of years, when he talked about optimism. No, he said and corrected me, I'm talking in terms of some generations. And of course that wisdom of his has turned out to be fairly correct. It should not be hidden, however, that during the decades that have followed, we've made also remarkable progress in cooperation with Russia on quite a number of different issues. And together, as a matter of fact, we laid then 25 years ago, we laid the foundations for a new system of peace and stability on the European continent. And that system was based on some very key lessons coming out of the past of Europe. One of them was that existing state borders always must be respected. That was laid down first by the so-called Belavesha Accords, which was the accords in a place outside of Minsk, which defined the principles for the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and were then confirmed with the so-called Badinter Commission as we were faced with the issue of the dissolution of former Yugoslavia. It wasn't that all of these borders and boundaries were particularly natural or particularly accepted or particularly followed national boundaries in every single aspect, particularly in the former Soviet Union. In the former Yugoslavia, there were quite a number of cases where that was not the case. But more or less all the borders and boundaries of Europe have been drawn in blood throughout history. And this particular principle was based on the very simple recognition that you open up the question of borders that once have been drawn in blood, you open up the prospects of blood starting to flow in Europe again. So think whatever you do about the borders and boundaries, but respect them and respect them and respect them. That was the first principle. If there should be any changes, it should be peaceful and it should be agreed by all. The other key lesson that we agreed on at the time that formed the basis for the new order is that there is a connection between the internal order and the external conduct of a state. And that was not just based on Hitler and Stalin and the obvious lessons of that. But if you go back somewhat longer in European history and read I see Karl Kaiser here, read Immanuel Kant, Som evigen friden, where that was really the principle that he launched. A republican order, which was the way you phrased the representative government, is the precondition for some sort of durable peace in Europe. So it was these principles that we, the West, and Russia, and everyone agreed with the Charter of Paris in 1990 and became the foundation for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, it wasn't just a temporary absence of war, but a system of cooperation and integration between nations and the respect for the fundamental human rights of each and everyone. And we got a remarkable long period of progress. Russia did develop. And our expectation, following Professor Pipes, was that, well, there will be the emergence of a middle class, there will be the opening up of society, there will be the gradual Europeanization of Russian society. Part of that did happen. If you look at the World Bank figures, they calculate that during the first part of this century, the middle class in Russia went from roughly 30% of the population to roughly 60% of the population. That's rather remarkable progress, although driven primarily by oil prices. But of course, the political development of Russia took another course. And this was, of course, also connected with the failure to develop a diversified economy, and instead relying almost exclusively on a centrally controlled extraction of natural resources, primarily, of course, oil and gas. Instead of a more modern and a more open Russia that we had hoped would emerge, and that we still hope will emerge, we saw the development of Russia as an increasingly authoritarian petrostate. And it is here that I do think that we find the root cause, a popular phrase, the root cause of the crisis that we are now confronted with in the east of Europe. Russia has emerged as a revisionist power, violating and questioning the very foundations of the European order, that European order of peace and stability that we had started to build, and that was built on principles that were agreed also with Russia at the time. A year ago, I think there were very few, at least there was no one that I encountered, that predicted that we would see not only the invasion, occupation, and annexation of Crimea, but also the determined use of what is today called hybrid warfare to establish what is called a Novorossiya and effectively dismember the independent and sovereign state of Ukraine. This particular crisis, which has seen 2 invasions of Russia, by Russia, of Ukraine within a year, started with attempts of the Kremlin to stop a free trade and association agreement between the EU and Ukraine. That agreement was, and is, it was hardly a novelty. It was negotiated between 2007 and 2011. It was initialed, as is the phrase, in early 2012, and it was hardly particularly sensational. Ukraine has a free trade agreement with Russia and with the Commonwealth of Independent States. And there is nothing that is incompatible between a free trade agreement in one direction and a free trade agreement in another direction. So when we proceeded with these particular agreements, it was not going to violate any of the existing commitments, any of the existing agreements that were there between Ukraine and Russia and the other CIS states. This, of course, agreement was part of, as was alluded to, the attempt of the EU to set up an Eastern Partnership in 2008. And the Eastern Partnership was an attempt to answer some of the demands that were coming from these countries for integration, cooperation, and help from the European Union. And I'm saying that because sometimes in the debate you get the impression that the EU proposed something. Yes, we did. But we proposed something in answer to the demands that were coming from them. It is a fact that nearly every state in the periphery of the European Union wants to be part of the European single market, wants to have access to the European market, wants to have access to the modernization potential that European integration actually represents, and that was the basis also of the Eastern Partnership. But if that agreement wasn't new, then strong Russian objections to Ukraine entering certainly was from sometimes in the middle of last year. And to me, this must be seen in connection with what happened when President Putin came back for the 3rd time in office and launched the so-called Eurasia Union and Customs Union and whatever as his new project. And then suddenly there was an incompatibility in his view between the direction that Ukraine had taken since years back and what he was trying to set up. And that is the root of the crisis. Following the intervention, this crisis has gone in stages, as you know, but following the intervention also of the regular units of the Russian armed forces, in contrast to small green men's and special forces and propaganda and artillery barrages across the border, but regular units of the Russian armed forces from mid-August, defeating de facto the Ukrainian forces there. We now have a ceasefire in place that looks like putting us on the path to another of the so-called frozen conflicts of Europe. And it should be remembered that that is then the fourth such frozen conflict that is established directly on the borders of Russia, and the fifth such frozen conflict that is supported by the armed forces of Russia in different places. There were certainly, if you look back over the years, so-called hawks in the debates uttering warnings about where Russia was heading, but no one, even of the hawks, even dared to predict what actually come to occur. Where we will be, and I said a year ago, we didn't know that we were going to be where we are. Do we know where we're going to be 1 year from now, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now? No, we don't. But I do know that President Putin has embarked on a new revisionist course. And I do know that according to the constitutional arrangement of Russia that he has put in place, he could well be in power in Russia a decade from now as well. And I do know that much of what will happen 1, 5, 10 years down the road will depend on what will happen with Ukraine in the immediate future. Sanctions against Russia as part of our policy to make clear that violations of borders is not acceptable, destabilization of countries is not acceptable, that is one thing. But I would argue that help to Ukraine in different ways is far more important in order to influence the eventual outcome. And in particular, help to Ukraine to reform its economy, to get rid of its vast corruption, to end its insane dependence on heavily subsidized gas, and to preserve and strengthen the democratic system of Ukraine. Because for all of the problems and all of the failures of Ukraine during the past 25 years, they have kept a democratic system of governance. If this succeeds, then Ukraine will survive, the ambitions of today's Kremlin will be blocked, and the fears for the future that we now see in large parts of Europe will subside. And then we can also return to a constructive discussion about what I call the integration of the different integrations of Europe, and to what we had a couple of years ago, a partnership for modernization also with Russia. Both are needed, and both would be beneficial to all. But if it doesn't succeed helping Ukraine, then I fear that we will be heading for a very and even more complicated European future. Thanks.
I wish to thank Professor Eckert and Nicholas Berggruen for providing us and me with this fine opportunity, which is difficult for me, however, because unlike Carl Bildt, I am neither an authority nor an expert really in foreign policy. So with your permission, I will follow up on what Carl Bildt so eloquently said, viewing the Ukrainian crisis and its possible aftermath more with the eyes of somebody who spent many years in the effort of building Europe from within. I spent 10 years at the European Commission, as was mentioned. And those 10 years between 1995 and 2004 were really the years in which the so-called enlargement policy was conceived, articulated, and implemented. So I will make basically two reflections, more question-raising reflections than answer-giving reflections. One is on how we can look again at the EU's enlargement policy in the aftermath of this very unpredicted Ukrainian crisis. And the second reflection is how and when could we ever get to a single foreign policy for the European Union, judging on the basis of the other areas in which the European Union has been able to achieve common positions and single policies. The Ukraine, of course, is not a member of the European Union. It was and still is in the process of being approached by the European Union and of wanting to approach the European Union. And Minister Bildt described the path toward the free trade agreement and the Eastern Partnership. But I cannot help, considering the Ukrainian crisis, of thinking how could the current attitude of President Putin bring us, if we had not in place the results of a very detailed and toughly worked enlargement policy. One of the key principles or propaganda items, I don't know, of President Putin is Russia is where Russians are. Russians are in many places in Central and Eastern Europe, but every nationality is in every other country in Central and Eastern Europe. So the consequences of the strict application where Russia is where Russians are would be major, just considering the Russians, would be magnified if we were to apply that principle, for example, to the Hungarians, many of which are in Romania, and the Romanians, many of which are in Hungary, and so forth. And it's interesting because the observation that Carl made on considering borders normally arrived at through blood, intangible, that is a principle that the EU certainly sticks to, although its business is really to destroy borders. And that has been so successfully done within our union. And yet, it is a construction of law, among other things, the European Union, and therefore it is essential to stick to that principle as regards the borders of the others and our own external borders. This is one of the aspects which I find continuously fascinating in this incredible construction, which is the European Union, which will never be, I'm afraid, the United States of Europe, will never be even a state, because by its own identity and nature, Europe is a flux, is not a state. And it's a fight to achieve a higher degree and more workable degree of integration, but in my view, not of arriving one day to eternal peace of being one state. How boring that would be. If we now you will know that many in Europe, in Western Europe, so to say, criticized the enlargement policy because it was too fast. It did not allow enough time to the newcomers to really modify in depth their economic and legal and democratic structures, and did not really allow time enough to the Western societies for them to absorb the idea that there would be new and different neighbors-made colleagues in one entity, the European Union. You may remember the syndrome in 2005 when the French citizens were asked to vote on a referendum on whether or not to ratify the constitutional treaty, that the syndrome of the Polish plumber was a key factor in the no vote to the ratification. Now, I must say that however important the complications may have been of taking in so many new member states relatively fast in historic terms, I think that only now can we assess how important it was to have done so, and to have done so rather quickly. I, as an Italian citizen, would feel today, in terms of security, in terms to fight, to organize crime, in terms of health security, health safety, etc., much more at risk if all the area, say, between Slovenia and Estonia, in obedience to a more gradualistic approach, were to be still today in the grey area of being a candidate for accession to the European Union, but not yet firmly rooted in the European Union, and of course I should add in NATO. So I believe that the value of a product which has been delivered, the reintegration of Western and Central and Eastern Europe, is being shown to be higher even than expected, as we see the recent tensions due to the policy of Russia. And I think one big challenge for the European Union, including the old member states, is really how to keep this tension, this nature of a EU being a magnet which attracts others even once others become member. This is really a very important policy priority, because the European Union is very much sought after, and then is often seen with disenchantment by those who made it to get in there. By the way, this is perhaps is totally out of our topic today, and is perhaps not nice and not seen compatible with the love for Europe that many of us have. But I think that Europe should be a prize for those who want it, who work hard to get it, who then make it, but should be a prison for nobody. So I think the policies for and the criteria for entering the European Union should be there, should be observed, but it should be a symmetrical movement. If a country really becomes fed up, for whatever reasons, of being a member of the European Union, I would favor a certain freedom of exit, not to encourage countries to leave, and I would not say this today in front of distinguished Scotsmen, but in order to have everybody appreciate at each moment the opportunity cost of not being there. Excuse me for these slightly para-philosophical considerations, but if you are, for example, in France, still a lot of the French population believes that all the investment in enlargement has been a sort of distraction relative to the deepening, to the construction of a deeper and deeper Eurozone, etc. I simply believe they are wrong. Second, and more quickly disposed of point, will we ever get a single foreign and security policy in Europe? Well, I think we should never be surprised that it is so difficult for Europe to get its act together. It's now 28 member states. You gather from what I just said that I wouldn't be against this number increasing to some extent over the next years. It's very, very rare in history that countries deliberately give up portions of their national sovereignty. And Europe is constructed in that way. Also, global cooperation like the G20 is constructed in this way, but with a major difference. The G20 may be sparkling in the aftermath of a crisis like it was the G20 in the US in 2008, in UK and in the US in 2008, 2009. But then as soon as the crisis fades away, the tendencies to repatriate the competences and the ability to make uncoordinated decisions is very strong. The European Union is itself the result of a crisis called World War II, and makes further progress under the impact of crisis, except that because there is a very strong institutional and legal order, it's not like in the G20 that the tide goes away. After each crisis, there is a more bringing together of sovereignties in certain policy areas, and that tends to stay even when a crisis is less visible and dramatic. Now, I would suggest that we compare the way in which European countries deliberately, or some of them deliberately, decided to share their monetary sovereignty with what will happen and when in the area of foreign policy. Central bank governors, ministers of finance are not less powerful entities and personalities in each national government than foreign ministers or defense ministers. Today, they even count more in many cases, and yet they have decided to give up a part of their national sovereignty. And this happened simply because they realized through a number of market crises that they believed they enjoyed national monetary sovereignty, but they did not. And the only one in Europe which did enjoy that was Germany. And when the spokesman of the German central bank at 2 p.m. on Thursdays announced the interest rate of Germany, then the others had a few seconds available in order to align. That was not monetary sovereignty. So in the end, they realized, and it was a fairly quick process, 10, 15 years, they realized that rather than having totally surrendered to the capital market their believed monetary sovereignty, it would have been better to share that sovereignty in a single currency and in one central bank to reacquire some sovereignty, though jointly exercised. I would like to be Carl Bildt and other few personalities of that standing in foreign politics and with that experience in order to reflect on what would be the gravity of a crisis in the foreign policy area for the EU to move ahead that much as it happened for monetary policy. The Ukrainian crisis is the most severe that we experienced in recent years. It is a huge threat and challenge to our foreign policies. It does not appear to be strong enough as a threat so as to generate, at least in the very short term, a more cohesive foreign policy. But if you have a chance in the 15 minutes of debate, Carl, before you leave, you could give us the truth about the slowness of this process. Are you much more stubborn, the foreign ministers, than the finance ministers? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those enlightening introductory remarks. I guess I believe many of you have questions to our speakers, but to set us off, let me ask a question to both of you. I think the result of our discussions today about the crisis is the question about how far Europe can go to save Ukraine, and how far Europe could go economically, how far Europe can go politically, how far Europe could go in military fashion. So what are the limits in your views on different ways in which Europe can really help Ukraine now in this situation, not in the long run, in a decade or so, but in what is going on today?
Well, primarily we have to understand that Ukraine will have to save itself, but we can do a lot to help Ukraine do that. I don't think it's a question of sort of massive amounts of money long term. Short term, money is needed. And there's a massive IMF program. I think there will have to be a new version of that. There's European macroeconomic support on top of that. We give bilateral aid. We have a rule of law mission there. We have other missions there. But it's a question of the politicians of Ukraine coming together and making the reforms necessary to give their economy strength again and get rid of corruption and those things. If they do that, our help will help. If they don't do that, our help won't help. It's roughly as simple as that. And if that happens, I think what Mr. Putin has managed to do, which is to some extent to strengthen the nation of Ukraine, and give it a more solid foreign orientation that was the case before, then that in itself will sort out the issue.
With your experience of internal EU politics, do you think that there may be some consensus on more radical ways of helping Ukraine solving the, standing against Putin, basically? Right? There is a lot of unhappiness about how deep the sanctions have been. How much they encourage Putin to ask for more and do more. So is EU able, right? Not ready, but able to do something more radical?
I honestly don't know. Because, first of all, there are many upcoming nationalistic and populistic forces in most of our member states which do not really condemn totally and without any reservation Mr. Putin. So the domestic front is not so united. Secondly, our societies, I believe, not only in Europe, but in Europe as well, are becoming more short-termist in their considerations, and many people do not go beyond the reasoning, well, we are in a hell of an economic recession in some of our countries. These sanctions on Russia hit us a lot. This is not the thing that should be done now. And it's very, very difficult for the public opinion at large to figure out the longer-term consequences of not being strong enough vis-à-vis Mr. Putin. So I see here too one particular facet of a much more general phenomenon that I see spreading in all our democratic systems, maybe also in the US, that there is more and more a short-termism and a populism that really stand in the way of forward-looking, long-term motivated decisions. And it would be a pity if we left these only to the Chinese and a few other countries.
Let me open the floor. Please introduce yourself when you speak, and if you could, to keep your questions to minimum given our time constraints. Professor Płochi.
Department of History and Ukrainian Research Institute. Thank you very much for wonderful presentations. Ability of Europe to react to the current crisis in a timely manner, and also ability of Europe to speak in one voice, was affected and is still affected by reliance on Russian gas. And the question that I have is, to what degree you think that this current crisis will change politics of European energy security, and or that will be just a bump on the road? Thank you.
You often hear that particular argument, which I don't really buy, that the more dependent you are on Russian gas, the more you stay quiet. I think the European country that is the most dependent upon Russian gas is probably Lithuania. And Lithuania hasn't been particularly quiet on this particular issue. I think Poland is also very dependent upon the gas from Russia. So the correlation ain't there in the way that is often perceived in the debate. That being said, what is going to happen is that you will see, and is underway since the previous gas supply crisis that we've had, that those countries that previously has been only dependent upon Russian gas and have had no alternative sources of supply are getting alternative sources of supply. And this has the advantage of introducing an element of competition, of price competition. When you have LNG terminals coming, it means that you can have others bidding for gas supplies to Europe. And as a matter of fact, we've seen prices coming down for Russian gas for the countries that have these alternative supplies. Germany pays far less for gas from Russia now than the Russians are charging Ukraine. And that is for the reason that Germany is beginning to be able to take in from LNG. And this is going to happen. And that will take away any sort of political leverage that Russia has with gas. And even more important, will take away their ability to dictate the price for the gas, which will be a healthy thing both for the relevant European economies and long-term even for Russia.
And I believe will finally add pressure to the long-delayed policy of constructing or increasing the capacity of energy interconnectors among the member states in the single market.
I guess I should introduce myself first. I'm at the Center for Astrophysics. So I have two questions for Minister Bildt. Your Excellence, allowing Europe's least disciplined country, Greece, to block Macedonian accession to the European Union and NATO, could this have serious consequences to the Western Alliance by eventually having President Putin return to the Balkans through Serbia and Macedonia? And the second question, you were one of the architects of the Dayton Agreement, along with the late Ambassador Holbrooke. Is there a danger of revising this agreement? And both of these questions are in light to the Ukrainian crisis.
Well, I try to be brief. On the first, yes, it would have been a huge advantage if the Macedonian issue had been sorted out, the name issue, because that would have made it possible to proceed with the integration. And I think the integration of the Balkans is enormously important for the long-term stability of the place. There hasn't been any war in the Balkans for quite some time. That's a good thing. Does it mean that all of the problems are gone? No. History has a tendency to repeat itself at times. Dayton Agreement, can it be revised? Of course it can, although it depends on what you mean. I mean, the Dayton Agreement is formally speaking just a piece of paper that ended the war and then a couple of annexes. One annex is Annex 4, which is a constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina that was agreed at the time. But one important part of the constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina in the Annex 4 is the provisions of how you change it. And any country in Europe is changing its constitution. And of course, Bosnia is perfectly entitled to develop, change, amend its own constitution. But I would like to stress, I think it should be done by the Bosnians, because either they are a country or they are not. So some Bosnians are running around to the outside world and say, you should change our constitution. Well, then you are not a sovereign country any longer. So they must demonstrate their maturity in running a country by themselves agreeing on how to change the constitution, and don't act as if they wanted to be a protectorate forever, be that under Vienna, or be that under Istanbul, or be that under Washington, or even under Brussels.
Stella in the back.
Gervas, I'm visiting scholar at the Center for European Studies. It seems to me that there are two different levels of this crisis in Ukraine. The first is geopolitical, between the great powers, US, the European Union, Russia, but the second level is on the ground, between the Ukrainians. And it seems to me that there are no very clear, that there are absolutely no guarantee that the rebels, Russian-speaking rebels in Donbass, for example, they are representative of the wishes of the population. But there is no guarantee that their opponents, they are representative of the wishes of populations too. So I think to answer that question, it will be to organize a really democratic referendum. I insist it's a democratic referendum, not it's what happened in Crimea. But I am wondering if there anyone who is really interested to solve this crisis in Donbass, to solve this problem in Donbass. Thank you.
Well, very briefly, I mean, I agree with you. The way to sort it out, that particular issue, is, I would argue, elections. The May 25 presidential elections in Ukraine were unique. Normally, if you go to most of the previous presidential elections in Ukraine, you've had a division of the country. You've had one getting the votes in the west and another one getting the votes in the east. In this particular case, Mr. Poroshenko got the plurality of the votes in every single constituency, including in the far east. And that was rather unique. That is what you normally happens when you invade countries. They unite. Now they're heading for parliamentary elections on October the 26th. It's going to be somewhat difficult in the Donbass, no question about that. But also in the ceasefire agreement, there is a provision for local elections to be held in the Donbass. Now these so-called sort of people's republics are saying they don't want to have elections. We see how that will be sorted out. But I agree with you. Elections are the way to sort these things out, so that you get elected representatives of people in the different parts of Ukraine, and then, along with the Bosnian model, so to say, they should sit down and try to sort things out, instead of doing it by sort of Russian tanks.
I'd like to ask Mr. Bildt whether, if we find, and nations bordering on the Black Sea find current events in Ukraine disconcerting, whether those living along the Caspian may find them even more so, in the sense that they are farther removed from NATO influence and have fewer resources to call upon, if this recrudescence of Russian expansion continues.
I think what is worth saying is that while a lot of our attention is on Ukraine, as it should be, the same agreements that sort of the Russians are objecting to in the case of Ukraine, we have them with Moldova and we have them with Georgia. They are putting Moldova under the same extreme pressure, or the difficulty invaded at the moment, but I mean far-reaching and far-going economic sanctions and attempted destabilization. Georgia is a somewhat more difficult case. And it's a more difficult case because they've done everything with Georgia. I mean, they have invaded, they have blocked all exports, they have tried to expel Georgians from Russia. Everything in the book has been tried and hasn't really worked. So the Georgians are in the more comfortable position. But for the other states, Caspian Sea states or whatever, we notice that they're all rather nervous at the moment. Minsk, to take Mr. Lukashenko, who is not necessarily one of our favorites, is maneuvering. The Kazakhstan is maneuvering because they see this particular policy has been expressed and executed versus Ukraine. They, of course, find it unsettling, to put it very mildly. So the entire region is nervous and unsettled, can be said.
To what extent do you think Western powers can deal with a country that is completely unprofessional? It appears that actually Putin does not have a plan. He just acts as whatever, whatever comes into his head. Can you even rationally deal with somebody who cannot even arrange for the proper provocation, which seems to be the only tool that he uses?
Well, the short answer to the question is yes, we can. And yes, we must. And if your description of Mr. Putin is correct, he's not entirely unique in the world. There are quite a number of those cases. But the way to do it is, of course, to limit his ability to do things that he's not supposed to do. You can call that a policy of containment to a certain extent, but it's a policy of blocking options, and his policy of sort of trying to influence his calculus all the time. So even if he doesn't know that, I mean, assume that he doesn't have a long-term plan. Assume that he operates on the spur of the moment and looks at every single situation and see what I can do. Our behavior affects the alternatives that are available to him. And under the assumption that your assumption of Mr. Putin is correct, that is the way to deal with such a situation and such a ruler, be that in Russia or be that in any other part of the world, because there are other such examples.
I'm afraid that Mr. Bildt needs to
But Mario Monti is here.
leave for the airport now, but we have few more minutes, and I would like to shift the discussion more toward EU issues, away from Ukraine, given the expertise of Prime Minister Monti. So we'll wait for a second for our guest to depart. Okay, so why don't we move a discussion a little bit and pay attention to the EU side, and if there are questions in the audience about EU policies. Let me ask the question about enlargement. How realistic do you think we can be about further enlargement of the European Union? We had views in the morning that, well, this may be a little bit of delay in bringing new countries in, but more often we can hear voices that enlargement, especially countries like Turkey or Ukraine, may never really happen. So what would be your view on the possibilities and possible timing of further enlargement?
Well, for the time period of the new Commission, the new Parliament, the Council, I believe that the enlargement will probably be limited, if it happens, as I hope it will, to countries in the Western Balkans who are not yet members of the European Union, because it seems to me that there it is the completion of a mosaic that, unless it is complete, it will not be stable and may well bring back those countries to a state of tension with each other. I do not believe that major steps will take place concerning the Ukraine and Turkey, but this is just my guess. Also because the EU will be very, very much occupied with the economic policies and the relationship with other parts of the world, our southern neighbors in particular. And in that case, it will not be, of course, enlargement, but I believe that a new policy vis-à-vis, in particular, Northern Africa will have to be developed, also in relation to the issue of migration, which is more and more necessary from a demographic pension systems and production point of view, but more and more difficult from the integration and psychological aspects.
Karl Kaiser.
As a prime minister, you went through the experience of both cutting and trying to implement structural reforms, which is, of course, what everybody has to do, particularly in the southern countries. Can you share with us your experience about the difficulties? Because structural reform, that's what everybody says has to be done. Everybody says it will be done, but it's very difficult, particularly when you're dealing with systems where politicians want to be re-elected.
Yes, each country, or most countries, are engaged in budgetary consolidation or the achievement of fiscal discipline and structural reforms. In my experience, but also in my analysis, watching other cases, I would say the following, that for practically any government, the obstacles that it has to face in order to achieve budgetary discipline are of course huge, but not as huge and as powerful as the obstacles it has to confront when it wants to do the structural reforms. Because some forms of achieving budgetary discipline can happen through measures that will hit numerous people in the country, but by relatively small amounts. Whereas if you want to do structural reforms, be it in the labor market or injecting more competition or opening up the markets for public utilities relative to the oligopoly power of the incumbents, or in reorganizing the public administration, you hit relatively small constituencies which normally have a very strong power as organized groups. So structural reforms even more difficult than budgetary discipline. If we now turn to what sort of help or pressure a government receives from Brussels, if one is a member of the European Union and more particularly of the Eurozone, we see the following, that there is a huge pressure coming from Brussels on achieving fiscal discipline, Maastricht Treaty, Stability Pact, 2-pack, 6-pack, fiscal compact, and whatnot, much less so in terms of achieving structural reforms. You remember the old and pale and ineffective and teethless Lisbon strategy of the year 2000. So no surprise that where governments are confronted with even stronger domestic oppositions and get less assistance from Brussels, i.e. structural reforms, they on average made less progress than on budgetary consolidation. This has been also the case in Italy. I should add a third element, which is the degree of visible emergency in a country at any moment in time. The emergencies that, for example, was there in Italy when I was asked to form a government was huge, was very, very high, and was very visible because each month it remained to be seen whether the Treasury would be able to issue and put in the market, have somebody buy sufficient Treasury bonds for it to be able to pay salaries, etc. And the spread over the German Bund hit very, very high levels, and this became a topic for minute-by-minute observation. So when it comes to financial emergencies, which are to be tackled mostly in the short term through budgetary cuts, the degree of emergency is high and helps a government. Structural reforms are normally designed in order to make the economy more competitive and to help growth, but one can say that it is a huge emergency when in a country you have a very high percentage of youth unemployment, for example. But that is not a measure that is perceived hour after hour by the public opinion. So for all these reasons, we are more backwards. In the case of Italy, one structural reforms that we hastened to do, and it was a deep one, a radical one, in 2 weeks. The first 2 weeks of the government was the pension reform, which put the public finances of Italy on a sustainable path, but much less progress was achieved in other reforms like the labor market. And it seems to me that in recognition of all this, the new Commission will probably concentrate on some sort of contractual arrangements between the EU and the individual member states, so that the efforts toward agreed targets of structural reforms will be monitored, will be the subject of pressure, and maybe even financially assisted by the EU.
Could we extend this to Ukraine? Of course, being a member of the EU puts the country in completely different position vis-à-vis Brussels. But can we imagine, are there any effective instruments EU could use to help Ukraine in hundreds of reforms which needs to be implemented in the country in a relatively short period of time?
Yes, certainly. Technical assistance is provided also to countries which want to modernize and which are not and will not become members of the European Union. But certainly the whole thing is more effective when you can provide carrot and stick, and when you ask a country which has the ambition to become a member state to do certain painful in the short-term reforms, like it is always the case, and you can have them view the price of membership. If this is not what they want, the traction will be not as great. But yes, I believe very much in the instruments of conditionality. However, conditionality, when exercised by an international organization, has one big danger, particularly when it is the European Union vis-à-vis its member states. It all depends on the attitude of the government of the member state concerned, because if the government asks the EU to play conditionality and to help it introduce unpopular measures, but then every second day the government complains because it's Brussels which wants us to have this pain, then this may be helpful in introducing structural reforms, but will have in the long term an effect of alienating the public opinion vis-à-vis the European Union, of which we have seen vast examples on the occasion of the last European elections.
Mr. Monti needs to head to the airport as well, but we'll have the last question. Nathan, please.
Just one quick question. Nathan Gardell's WorldPost. The current Prime Minister of Italy has taken the unusual step of eliminating the second house of the legislature, the Senate. What effect will that have on governance in Italy? Why is that so important?
I should first of all declare that I am a member of that house. I am a senator, and I was made senator for life by the President of the Italian Republic. There can be at any time no more than 5 such strange persons. I even thought I might become the first to be able to have a business card with the qualification former senator for life, still alive, in case the Senate would be completely eliminated or the positions of senator for life would be. Apparently, I will not have this privilege, so I will have only the privilege of sharing with 4 other people the rather banal qualification of being senator for life without any addition. But no, I don't believe that it was so critical for the smooth functioning of Italian governance, or rather, to some extent, yes, because Italy is one of the few countries which, having 2 chambers, has exactly the same functions for both. So redundant is the least we could say. On the other hand, there is a perfect constitution in Europe, in Southern Europe, with only 1 house in the parliament, not redundant in terms of membership, only 300, a very good constitution under many other respects, not necessarily performing so well. That country is Greece. So I agree on simplifying the system, in the limit having 1 house only. What I do not see positively is the composition that the Prime Minister wants to give to the Senate, because it will be a representation of local Italy. One could say that also the Senate in France and the Bundesrat reflect the territory, but I believe this is not being done in the best way. At any rate, one of the few criticisms that so far I have for the current Italian Prime Minister is that he invested a lot of time and of political energy and capital in achieving this reform, which has been achieved in the first of several readings between Senate and House, whereas probably the priority should have been the economic reforms.
The last question suggests that perhaps, given the topic of our discussion, Italy is the future of Ukraine.
Sorry?
That Italy may be the future for Ukraine, and this wouldn't be such a bad solution given the current situation.
Well, preferable probably to the Ukraine being the future of Italy.
That's probably preferable.
Okay, so we can settle on this.
Thank you so much. Let me thank Mr. Monti for his presence here this afternoon, and to Berggruen Institute on Governance and to the Center for European Studies, and you all for participating in this discussion. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you all in our future debates on the future of Europe. Thank you so much.